There's a lot of talk right now about the housing crisis. We're told it's a shortage, but we also see empty units. Rents keep rising, but wages don't. Those things don't really line up. And when things don't line up, it usually means we're not seeing the whole picture. This topic doesn't benefit from exaggeration. The problem is serious enough just as it is. To understand it, you have to look at the parts. It's a bit like opening a Swiss watch. Intimidating at first, but once you see how the pieces fit together, it's not such a mystery. There isn't one reason housing feels broken right now. What's happening is a stack of pressures. Some economic, some political, some institutional, all feeding off of and fortifying each other. Today, we're going to slow things down and look at those pieces one at a time. Not to amplify the problem and not to pin it on one group, to understand why it's happening everywhere and why it feels so hard to escape. Because once you see how the pieces interact, a lot of the common explanations stop making sense. So let's start at ground level with renters and what it actually means to be cost burdened. Current data says that about half of renters are cost burdened, which means they're spending more than 30% of their income on housing and utilities. In other words, housing is crowding out other necessities. This doesn't mean rent is going unpaid, which is how it's often framed on social media. And that's a subtle but important distinction. This didn't suddenly appear in 2025. It's a long-running structural problem. What's changed recently isn't how many renters are cost burdened, but how badly. 15 to 20 years ago, many were just over the 30% threshold. Maybe 32 to 35% of their income went to rent. So they still had some flexibility for food, transportation, and emergencies. Now, more and more renters are severely cost burdened. In some cases, spending 50% or more of their income on rent and utilities. This group is growing faster than the first, which makes the situation even more fragile. Once rent hits around 50% of income, one missed paycheck becomes a crisis. Medical bills, car repairs, or other unexpected expenses trigger an eviction risk because there's no buffer in place to absorb the shock. When housing eats that much of your income, everything else gets harder. Crossing 30% is stressful. Crossing 50% is destabilizing. Many of us know what it's like when even small, unexpected expenses feel like threats rather than inconveniences. Cost burden used to be concentrated. Now it's everywhere. It used to be that high rent stress was mostly seen in big coastal areas, tourist hubs, and a few fast-growing cities. If you were priced out, you could move inland or to a smaller metropolitan area. There used to be somewhere cheaper to go. Now there often isn't, which is why the crisis is now national. Exit options are declining too. Historically, renters would eventually buy starter homes. This locks in stable housing costs while building equity instead of paying rent that goes up every year. But now, home prices and interest rates are higher, so down payments have to be higher too. The result is that people now must rent for longer, and the cost burden becomes chronic when it used to be temporary. In other words, renting used to be a phase. Now, for a lot of people, it's a long-term condition. That's when planning for the future starts to feel less like choice and more like triage. This lack of exit options is the most underappreciated shift, and possibly the most important. So the question becomes, if renting used to be temporary and now it isn't, what changed? For most of the post-war period, housing was treated primarily as shelter. You bought or rented a place to live. Prices moved, but slowly, and stability mattered. Housing didn't stop being shelter, but it got a second job. It became something expected to generate steady financial returns. For decades, rent mostly just covered the costs of holding a property: maintenance, taxes, financing. The real payoff came later when the property appreciated. Over time, that expectation flipped. Rent itself became the profit. Once that expectation sets in, the logic around housing shifts. Prices aren't just tied to what people can afford. They're tied to what the asset can produce. That changes how pressure behaves. In the past, when people were stretched too thin, prices softened, or people moved, or they eventually bought. The system had release valves. Now, high prices don't automatically trigger correction. Full occupancy isn't the goal. Maintaining returns is. This is why cost burden doesn't fix itself anymore. The pressure just sits there, year after year, like an anchor. Once rent becomes the profit, the next challenge is consistency. You need a way to make sure rents rise predictably, not just when a landlord guesses right, and across entire markets. That's where modern property management practices come in. Rent setting has shifted away from local judgment and towards standardized pricing models. Instead of asking, what will keep good tenants here? The question became, what is the highest rent this unit can command without hurting overall returns? These systems look at things like demand, vacancy tolerance, lease timing, and comparable properties. The goal isn't full occupancy, it's optimal revenue. That's an important change. Vacancy used to be a problem. Now, in many cases, it's a calculation. Fewer units at higher rent can generate more income than full buildings at lower prices. This is from the Department of Justice's lawsuit against RealPage. In its own words, RealPage, quote, helps curb landlords' instincts to respond to down market conditions by either dramatically lowering price or by holding price when they are losing velocity and/or occupancy. Our tool ensures that landlords are driving every possible opportunity to increase price, even in the most downward trending or unexpected conditions. When many property managers adopt the same logic, rents start moving together. Increases cluster. Price drops slow down. And the idea of market rate becomes less about local wages and more about where the system says the threshold is. From the renter's perspective, this just feels like everywhere is raising rent all at once, because functionally, that's what's happening. This is how housing's new job shows up in real life. It is now managed according to financial performance instead of stability. And once housing is managed this way, it naturally attracts a different kind of owner. Small landlords used to dominate rental housing. They were local, often individual, and their decisions were shaped by long-term ownership. But a system built around predictable rent growth favors scale. The more units you control, the more stable the returns look, and the easier it is to justify higher prices, longer vacancies, and aggressive strategies. That's where large investors enter the picture. Not because they're uniquely clever, but because the system now rewards their strengths: access to capital, patience, and volume. When investors buy housing this way, they're not looking for communities. They're looking for yield. A home is a line item on a spreadsheet. A neighborhood is a field to be planted for harvesting later. This changes the game completely. Properties can now sit empty without stress. Maintenance can be deferred. Rent increases don't need to consider local wages, only what the model says will hold. And because money can now move instantly, this logic doesn't stay put. Once a place is identified as undervalued, money arrives in a snap. Prices reset, and the cycle repeats somewhere new. This is one reason the idea of moving somewhere cheaper stopped working. Now, when people move, capital has learned to follow them. It gets to the point where you keep relocating just to stay in front of the wave. We opted to get out of the water altogether by moving abroad. See, when housing works this way, scarcity becomes valuable. And once scarcity becomes valuable, people with power have an incentive to protect it. This is where local opposition to new housing comes in. Often called NIMBYism, it's usually framed as concern for things like neighborhood character, traffic, or scale. But in practice, it's much simpler. A way to limit new supply in places where demand is already high. This isn't just about saying no. It's about delay, appeals, design reviews, height limits, parking requirements, environmental challenges. Each one sounds reasonable on its own. Together, they make housing slow, expensive, and risky to build. The result is fewer homes, especially the kinds that would relieve the pressure. Smaller units, multifamily buildings, workforce housing. And here's the important part. Once housing is scarce, everyone who already owns it benefits. Sale prices rise, rents rise, existing assets become more valuable. So, while NIMBY opposition is often described as emotional or aesthetic, it actually has a very practical effect. It protects property values by keeping supply tight. This is why high demand places struggle to build even when the need is obvious. The system rewards obstruction, and over time, obstruction becomes the norm. When new housing is blocked like this, any institution that adds people without adding homes makes the problem worse. Even in places where housing is scarce and difficult to build, demand doesn't stop growing. That's because some of the biggest demand increases don't come from individuals. They come from institutions. Universities are a clear example. Many college towns have seen steady enrollment growth for decades, even as housing construction lagged far behind. Students arrive, staff arrive, faculty arrive, but often housing doesn't. The result is predictable. Students compete with local renters. Single-family homes get packed more densely. Rents rise faster than local wages, and the surrounding city tries to absorb the impact. What's striking is that universities aren't required to house the people they admit. They can grow enrollment without adding proportional housing, and the cost gets pushed outward. The same pattern shows up in other areas. Employers expand without building workforce housing. Tourism-driven cities encourage short-term stays without adding long-term housing, which is a whole nother video. None of this is illegal, but it's also not neutral. When institutions add people into a constrained housing market, they intensify every pressure that's already there. This is how places end up with plenty of jobs, plenty of students, and nowhere affordable for the people who make the place run to live. When costs get pushed outward like this, the question isn't whether there's harm, it's who's responsible for addressing it. By this point, a pattern should be clear. The costs of the housing crisis are widespread, but the benefits are concentrated. Renters absorb instability. Workers absorb long commutes and stagnant wages. Cities absorb homelessness. Families absorb stress. Meanwhile, the financial upside flows ever upward into property values, returns, and tax bases. That imbalance matters politically. When the people who benefit most from the system also have the most influence over local decisions, change becomes difficult. At the local level, homeowners vote in high numbers and show up consistently. Renters move more often, vote less locally, and carry far less political weight. At higher levels, housing policy competes with donors, institutions, and industries that benefit from rising prices. Across party lines, there's little appetite for reforms that threaten asset values. So instead of fixing the problem, politics often focuses on managing the fallout. More enforcement, more policing, more rules about where people can exist rather than why they're being pushed there in the first place. This is how homelessness gets criminalized instead of prevented, how workers get blamed instead of housed, how the symptoms become the target while the causes remain untouched. It's not that solutions don't exist. It's that the system doesn't reward the people who would have to implement them. When a system won't correct itself, people adapt. They don't have a choice. One response is doubling up. More adults in the same unit. More generations under one roof. Homes designed for families quietly becoming shared housing for survival. Another response is leaving. First neighborhoods, then cities, then entire states. In extreme cases, like ours, moving out of the country. People don't always move toward opportunity. Sometimes they move away from pressure. And when those options run out, people start normalizing things that would have sounded unthinkable a decade ago. Living in vehicles, unsafe structures, converted garages, storage units. These aren't solutions, they're stress responses. The most visible consequence is homelessness, but that's the end of a long chain. Meanwhile, communities feel the strain in other ways. Labor shortages, longer commutes, fewer people able to do essential work. Places that look prosperous on paper, but are hollowing out in practice. This is what it looks like when housing stops functioning as shelter and starts functioning purely as an asset. The system stays stable, but people don't. By now, this probably doesn't feel much like a mystery anymore. The housing crisis isn't the result of one bad policy, one bad group, one sudden shock, or a particular political party. It's the outcome of a system that slowly changed its priorities and then locked those priorities in place. Once you see that, a lot of familiar arguments stop working. It's not just about supply. It's not just about demand. And it's not just about personal choices. What makes this moment difficult is that understanding the problem doesn't immediately fix it. The pressure doesn't disappear just because you can name where it comes from. But clarity does matter. It changes what you blame. It changes what you expect. And it changes how you interpret the things you're seeing, from rising rents to empty units to the increasingly extreme ways people are forced to adapt just to stay housed. From here, the conversation doesn't end. It gets more specific on details like pricing software, institutional impacts, and short-term rentals. If this feels heavy, that's because it is. This isn't a crisis you can think your way out of in a single sitting. It's a system that reshapes people's lives quietly over time, often without a single dramatic breaking point. For most people, it just shows up as constant pressure. This is the system we were living inside while trying to make ordinary decisions, where to live, how much risk was acceptable, and what stability even meant anymore. At some point, this stops being something you're analyzing and starts being something you're living. Understanding how housing actually works didn't give us answers. It didn't make trade-offs any easier. It changed the questions we were asking. We went from wondering why things felt so precarious to understanding that the uncertainty isn't accidental. It's built into the system itself. This video isn't meant to wrap the issue up neatly. It's meant to explain the structure. So the next time you hear a simple explanation or a convenient scapegoat, you can recognize what's missing. A lot of what we've talked about today is the context we were living in before we decided to leave the US. If you're already in that headspace, not curious but seriously considering it, we put our process into a course called Pack Up and Bounce. It's specifically about leaving, and it's built for people who want structure instead of guesswork. If that's not why you're here,
help yourself to as much food as you like and have a safe journey. No hard feelings.
This conversation matters either way. As I close this one out, a quick reminder to like, comment, and subscribe if you haven't already. Also, please share this video with anyone you think might get some value from it. These are all ways to support the channel and get our work seen by more people. And none of them cost you a cent. Thanks as always for watching. See you in the next one.